everyone okay if I I assume? Okay, so we'll start in 3 minutes. Oh, hi, Keenan.
Hi, Liam.
Hi, Andrea.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't understand what's in the schedule.
So unfortunately, Julian has a conflict and
Okay.
is teaching. So I was trying to shuffle people around, but in the end, I think we're going to have to cancel Julian's talk, and then we're going to move Kevin up from the 4th slot to the 3rd slot just so we don't have a hole. So the upshot is that the schedule is not quite as compressed. I don't know exactly how tight people's schedules are, but we might have a little bit more time for if speakers want to take more like 20 minutes instead of 15, that's totally great. Now we have like ample time for that.
Okay. And so basically the session I was chairing is not happening.
Correct.
Okay. That's okay.
Yeah. Hi, Claire.
Good morning. Good afternoon. Good evening.
It's like very early for you, is it not?
Well, it's 10 after 7.
Could be worse.
It has been worse.
I know.
And somehow the West Coast people are always the people who have to get up early.
Well, Asia's usually, the folks in Asia usually have a tough time.
They just don't
In
get
the middle
to
of the
well,
night.
yeah.
Mm.
At least in Asia, we don't have to wake up early. Sleeping late is easier than waking up
You just
early.
never go to bed, right?
Yeah.
Are people gathering? Can you see them, Liam?
Yeah.
Hi, Ram. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Nice to see you.
Good seeing you too. By the way, I heard congratulations are in order. I heard you're now the chair.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Congrats.
Thank you.
Hey, Ram. Hey, John. Great to see you guys. Throw up this. Everyone sees the screen share?
Yep.
Okay, great. So we'll start in 1 minute. Just let people trickle in. Yeah, it should tell you when you come in that it's being recorded. So if anybody has a strong objection to that, just let me know. But hoping to be able to post this somewhere at some point. All right, I think we can start. So welcome to the IROS 2021 workshop on evaluating the broader impacts of self-driving cars. In many ways, this is a follow-on workshop of a workshop that some of us organized last year, which was the IROS 2020 workshop on driving benchmarks, and several of the panelists and organizers were part of that thing. So the organizers this time around are myself from the University of Montreal, Angela Scholig, who has a conflict right now because she has another workshop, Jane Lappin from the TRB, Claire Tomlin from UC Berkeley, Andrea Gensi from Zurich, and Matt Walter from TTIC, who also has a conflict. I think he's like on a ship or something. So what's the objective of this workshop? I mean, I've been kind of inspired by recent keynotes and stuff at NeurIPS that it's important every once in a while to take a step back from the technology. We're all, especially as roboticists, we have our heads really deep in the technological problems, but that every once in a while, it's a good idea to surface and think about the broader impacts of the work that we're doing. And so, of course, there's been an incredible progress in self-driving cars in the last decade or more. And it seems like it's some kind of autonomous mobility systems are being actually deployed and fielded. And so it's like very, very exciting times for us as roboticists. But it could be that there are other like impacts and other metrics that we should be thinking about that are like broader or more meaningful in terms of the impact that this technology is going to have on society than just the number of disengagements per mile or something like that. And so the hope with this workshop was to invite speakers who are not roboticists by training, but have knowledge of robotics for sure. And then to get expert panelists who are mostly roboticists, and that these speakers would talk to us about some of these adjacent but very related fields. And so we have talks today that are going to relate to the like legal implications, ethical implications, safety implications, evaluating risk, all of these things, which are very much related but adjacent to the development of the technology. So the schedule for today, after a quick shift around because we had a conflict. So we're going to start right away with Bryant Walker-Smith, who's going to give a talk on theme 1, legal, that is going to be moderated by Keenan. Theme 2 is going to be risk. The speaker is Ann Collin from Motional, moderated, and then there'll be a panel moderated by Claire Tomlin. And then the third theme will be safety. The speaker is Kevin Gay from Aurora, and that will be moderated by Jane. So the idea here is that for each talk, the talk will be 15. We have more time now because we had a cancellation. So 15 to 20 minutes, followed by a panel of 15 to 20 minutes where we can try and dig a little bit deeper into some of the themes that are raised during the talk. For any of the other participants who are in the audience, please feel free to ask questions using the Zoom chat. This is just not a webinar style meeting. It's just a regular meeting. So raise your hand and you can feel free to take over the turn on your camera and ask a question during the panel session. I'll introduce the panelists now, but then each of the speakers will be introduced in turn. So we have at least 5 panelists that I can see. We have Dr. Fabio Bonsignorio, who is the CEO of Heron Robotics. He was also a speaker at last year's workshop and has done a tremendous amount of work in benchmarking in general. We have Professor John Leonard, who is one of the grandfathers of SLAM. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that. Fathers. He's not that old. And was part of the development of the MIT team during the DARPA Urban Challenge, and has been now working at Toyota Research for some number of years, and has incredible expertise in self-driving, and also has thought about some of these like harder problems and how they relate to societal impacts. We have also Professor Ram Vasudevan from the University of Michigan, who was also involved last year and has also got a startup going that's doing some kind of autonomous mobility thing. And so we're very excited to have Ram here. We have Dr. Guglielmo Albanese, who is at Swiss Re, which is a reinsurance company, and particularly interested to hear the perspective as pertains to evaluation of risk. And then we have Professor Marcelo H. Eng Jr., who's probably the only one for whom it's the middle of the night right now. So thank you. Prof. Marcelo has been doing a ton of work for decades also in mobility, autonomous mobility systems, particularly not always autonomous cars, but also smaller scale vehicles like autonomous golf carts and wheelchairs and assisted mobility and stuff like that. So really excited to have the panel. And I think without further ado, I'll kick it over to Keenan to introduce the first speaker, who's Bryant Walker-Smith.
Yeah, thank you, Liam. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the day, Professor Bryant Walker-Smith. Bryant is an associate professor in the School of Law and the School of Engineering at the University of South Carolina. He's also an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School and co-director of the University of Michigan Project on Law and Mobility. He previously led the Emerging Technology Law Committee of the Transportation Research Board of the National Academies for 6 years, and served on the U.S. Department of Transportation's Advisory Committee on Automation and Transportation. Trained as a lawyer and an engineer, Bryant advises cities, states, and countries, and the United Nations on emerging transport technologies. He co-authored the globally influential Levels of Driving Automation, drafted the leading model law for automated driving in the United States, and taught the first legal courses dedicated to automated driving, hyperloops, and flying taxis. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Bryant, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Keenan. I'm really happy to be here, particularly because I enjoyed last year's session so much. It is such a sharp group of interdisciplinary thinkers. So Liam asked me to speak to AV safety from a legal perspective. And that's what I will try to do. Although right at the outset, I want to just note how limited law is. So generally, when we're talking about law, it's what is the law? What does the law say? What did a court decide? What does the statute say in print? What does the contract read? This is descriptive. What is law? Often lawyers will also ask, well, what will the law be? What will the legislature enact? Or how will a court decide this case? Or how might an agency develop new regulations? This is the predictive. And then the very tempting third circle here is what should the law be? Right? What should a court decide? What should a legislature enact? What should an agency decide? And I have these overlapping because in fact they are. Normative arguments can affect the descriptive reality of law because courts, for example, will decide sometimes based in part on policy grounds. So these are overlapping, but the important caveat is that lawyers have particular expertise in saying what the law is and even what will the law be. And to some extent, we're good at making arguments what the law should be, but it's not that we have any special expertise necessarily in this normative. This is informed as much by public policy and ethics and the natural and applied sciences as it is by a bunch of lawyers arguing what we think the answers to all these questions should be. And so in that way, law is not synonymous with ethics, with non-legal ethics, or with public policy. And all of your expertises are essential to properly informing this circle, which in turn can shape this one and that one. However, notwithstanding that big caveat, I always operate in that third box and talk a lot about what I think the law should be. And so I'm going to do a lot of that in the talk today. First of all, I just want to touch back on what I said at last year's session, because I think it connects into this discussion this year. Last year, we talked a lot about how safe is safe enough. And I had both a retrospective and prospective answer. Right? Retrospective is after a crash has happened, we're looking back and saying, was the vehicle safe enough? And there are three big pillars here. Right? Was the system at least as safe as a human in the particular maneuver? And was it at least as safe as a comparable automated driving system would be? And was it safer than the last system that failed? And if the answer to any one of those is no, my argument is the system is not reasonably safe. And so that's actually comparatively pretty easy, all the evidentiary questions notwithstanding. The much more tricky question is the prospective safety before deploying a system. This is something that we never actually know. And in some ways, it's unfair to expect an answer for these systems today. But my answer is that reasonable prospective safety means reasonable confidence that the automated driving system developer is worthy of our trust. So why trustworthiness? As I talked about, safety is fundamentally a marriage rather than a wedding. It is a lifelong commitment rather than a one-time event where we all get dressed up, run a test, and celebrate with champagne. Second, AVs are only as safe as the companies behind them. Fundamentally, AV safety is going to depend on AV company safety. Third, companies don't act directly, right? They are a legal concept, a legal creature. And so companies act through their human agents, their managers and employees, and their machine agents, their algorithms, their physical systems. And this means fundamentally that companies will drive automated vehicles. And when companies fail in that task, they can still do right, even if their technologies have failed. They can still explain and compensate and fix, at least to some extent. So what does it mean to be a trustworthy corporate driver? I said, well, a trustworthy company, hence driver, shares its safety philosophy, makes a promise to the public, and keeps that promise. It says, this is what we're doing, this is why we think it's reasonably safe, and this is why you can believe us. It makes a promise to the public by marketing only what it believes to be safe, by being candid about its limitations and failures, and by promising to make things right when it fails. And then it keeps these promises by doing that, by appropriately managing public expectations, not, for example, calling its system full self-drive, by supervising its entire product lifecycle, and by mitigating harms promptly, fully, and publicly. And so the key for policymakers and indeed lawyers is to look for early breaches of trust, signs that a company is not keeping its word, is puffing, is evading its responsibilities. That could suggest more serious problems down the line. Now, some of that is summarized in this paper I mentioned last time. I'm going to pull from this as well for my points this year. All right, so this year I want to just touch on 4 things. First, defining safety. Second, prioritizing safety. Third, human and machine authority and the tension between them. And finally, traffic enforcement. So we talk a lot about safety. Safety is really important. So often, though, I don't think we step back and appropriately define what we're talking about. And this has real consequences for the evaluation of systems and for the implementation of public policy. So the opposite of defining safety is effectively defining danger. And what do we mean? Is it just deaths and physical injuries? So often traffic statistics are measured purely in deaths, not even with respect to physical injuries that can in some ways be at least as illuminating, particularly when vehicles themselves get safer for their occupants. Are we going beyond deaths and physical injuries to recognize emotional injuries, financial injuries, not just to the direct victims of crashes, but to the indirect victims, the families, the loved ones, the observers, the bystanders? All of this is in terms of crashes. And depending on the year, and looks like it will be a bad year, we see up to 40,000 people in the US alone die directly in traffic crashes, well over 1 million globally. That's not the only source of danger, though. We could also talk about present victims of present pollution. And driving kills at least as many people through airborne pollution as it does through crashes, with a lot more uncertainty, and most of that uncertainty pointing upward to many times more deaths alone from transportation pollution. Are we also talking not just about the present consequences of present pollution, but the future consequences, climate change, among others? Essentially, to people not yet born count in our analysis of safety. How about fear of unjust enforcement or the reality of unjust enforcement? Is that part of safety? Lack of exercise, is that a transportation danger? Fear of walking and biking, people who do not engage in active mobility because they are afraid that they will die or be unwelcome in the public space. Lack of adequate mobility, people who cannot get to their jobs or their services. Is that a danger that impedes safety? Lack of community as neighbors are cut off by our transportation system, and so on and so on. Each of these you could expand upon. Right? I talked about air pollution, but noise pollution, particularly in Europe, is now seen as a major health problem, a key disruptor of sleep, an increase of stress, and a serious public policy issue that gets much less attention in the US unless we're talking about building big walls next to freeways. The key is when we talk about safety, what belongs in our scope? Where do we draw the line for our analysis? Something can be both really hard to measure and really important to measure. And yet the old adage is true, like what counts is counted and what's counted counts. So I'll give you an example of this. Particularly in Europe, the safe systems approach is a very important public policy input to designing transport systems. That is looking at safety, not just in terms of one actor, a driver, usually, but looking at all the decisions that go into dangers on the road, from infrastructure to vehicle design, to the incentives for individual drivers. And we can talk about just safe systems. We can say, well, justice, that is transportation equity, non-discrimination, is a really important value. Should we apply the same tools of the safe systems approach to justice to have in effect a just system approach? Should we talk therefore about safe and just systems? Or do we say that a safe system actually requires justice, that you cannot have safety if you are in a state of lack of justice? Conversely, do we say a just system requires safety because you cannot be treated justly, you cannot be a subject of the law deserving protection if you are already dead? And behind each of these is in some ways a fundamental disagreement about how we navigate what could be very real tensions among these goals. Now, if our goal is safety, however we've defined it, then this also demands, I think, a little circumspection. So here I have two charts. One is road deaths per billion vehicle kilometers. So this is how your chance of driving based on how often you die. And we can see that in the US, the rate is twice that of the United Kingdom and significantly higher than Australia and Canada, countries that we routinely get compared to. If you look just in terms of road deaths per population per capita, the US does far, far worse. We're 3 times that of the United Kingdom because people in the US drive more. But by either measure, there's something wrong here. There is something that other countries are doing that the United States is not. And that reflects a basic disregard for lives. So what is this low-hanging fruit? Well, anything from alcohol ignition interlocks to speed regulators to active safety systems that are actually mandated to automated enforcement to maintenance inspections of vehicles to traffic calming to other forms of safe infrastructure and many, many others. Now, many of these are not sexy in the way that advanced robotic systems are. And many advanced robotic systems are not sexy in the way that automated vehicles are. Automated vehicles are flashy and shiny and nifty. And so much burden has been put on them to solve problems that might actually have easier, more near-term solutions, at least from a technical matter. And I've been saying this for years. This is from a 2015 paper, all of the strategies that governments could take nominally to advance automated driving, but really to improve safety, equity, mobility, and access. The challenge here is, do we view automated driving as a technical solution? That is something that negates the need for other technological measures because it's easier, better, faster, cheaper. Essentially, it's the technology itself that will solve the problem. Or do we view automated driving as effectively a policy solution? That is, it's something that we can attach good policy to when we cannot seem to manage that politically with today's system. Is it easier to require automated vehicles to be electric than it is to require everybody today to buy electric conventional vehicles? California thinks so. Is it easy perhaps to impose more obligations or requirements on the developers of AVs or the operators of AV fleets than it is on your typical taxi or Uber driver? Maybe. And in that case, it's not the technology that actually is the key. It's the newness of the technology that allows us politically to do things that we can't do in today's status quo. Now, there's a flip side of this, and this is very frustrating for me because I think, justifiably criticized Tesla, particularly for a lot of its marketing decisions, as well as some of its engineering decisions. Last year, for example, I asked, if we can't trust you when you call your system full self-driving, how can we trust you when you call your system safe? This is key to what it means to be trustworthy. So I have to, however, now defend Tesla ever so slightly. A lot of focus has been on inattentive driving in Tesla vehicles, particularly those with some of Tesla's advanced driver assistance systems. This may well be a problem, particularly when it comes to fire trucks. This is a problem that affects millions of vehicles. Inattentive driving in other vehicles with level 1 and even 2 advanced driver assistance systems may be a problem, as these systems perhaps encourage people to pay less attention to the road. This is an order of magnitude more. This could affect tens of millions of vehicles, but seems to get a little less attention. And we know that inattentive driving in every kind of vehicle on the road today, including those that are 30 years old, is clearly a problem. You can see people who are treating their 1990 Buick as a self-driving car when it clearly is not. This affects hundreds of millions of vehicles and gets talked about probably the least in policy, in the public, and in certain regulatory actions. This is a mismatch between potential issues and solutions. So part of this ties into how we think about our transportation system and how much discretion and authority we want to give to these individual human actors who might tend toward the careless. And so as we think about the design of systems, and this is probably just a fancy way of describing HAL in Space Odyssey, is first, are human authority and discretion ultimately necessary for safety, right? Do we need to give humans final control for the purpose of safety, either because they are more flexible or long-term that advances some safety benefit? Separate from that, we might ask, are human authority and discretion themselves independent values that belong in an analysis? Even if that means the loss of more life, are human authority and discretion themselves worthy of some value? Now, this is an ethical question. This isn't necessarily a legal question. It's an ethical question that necessarily informs the legal analysis. And we can see lots of examples of that today, whether it was the emergency braking system that possibly reduced the death toll during a attack in Germany involving a truck, or whether it was the Boeing 737 MAX system that fought with its pilots and ultimately resulted in hundreds of lives lost, whether it's something as simple as a keypad that keeps somebody out of the cockpit. Each of these involves this tension between human and machine authority. Now, the traditional approach has been to give humans a wide amount of authority necessarily, and then, at least on the roads, to every now and then pull them over more or less arbitrarily, although there's some evidence that that's also discriminatory. And I think traffic enforcement is an area that deserves so much more technical, legal, and policy attention as we have new technologies hitting vehicles and roads and individuals and law enforcement. And so first question is, I wonder if we are moving toward what we might technically call perfect enforcement, which is ubiquitous enforcement. Every time there is a violation, there is detection and penalty. Not that we will get there, but are we getting far closer, or do we at least have the potential to get far closer to that than we have in the past? If so, is this kind of perfect enforcement actually ideal? Is there an argument for under enforcement? How does this enforcement relate to not just our laws, but to the development of norms, to compliance, to behaviors? If you put laws and enforcement and norms and behaviors on a chart, you can draw all sorts of lines of influence among them. And these must be better understood as we think about how technology starts creating new challenges and opportunities for enforcement. And the other aspect of enforcement that technologies potentially unlock is in the realm of private enforcement. And I've used this example for years because I think it at least illustrates a way of thinking about this that's well beyond the 1-800 how's my driving stickers that some companies will put on their trucks. Imagine if in the future there is an automated vehicle operated by a large conglomerate that has to stop for a pedestrian who steps into the road. Now that company may well be able to, not perfectly, but perhaps likely identify who that person might be. Will they share that information with law enforcement? Will law enforcement decide to and be legally able to issue a ticket? Or will that company take more private enforcement measures? Will they deny that pedestrian access to their rideshare service for a day, a week, a month? If they have other services that are part of their company, will they use the pressure from those to enforce their vision of compliance on others? These are, again, both challenges and opportunities that speak not just to safety in a narrow sense, and not even safety in a broader sense, but to so many of the public policy goals that technologies are going to implicate. On that, I will stay tuned, and I will also use that as an opportunity to, again, thank you for bringing these perspectives into the technical sphere and for engaging with them so thoughtfully. It is a credit to the organizers and to the participants. And with that, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, great. I'm hoping to get some questions out of the chat, so I'll just wait for some of those to come in. Do you have a couple of questions? So we do have a panel here. I guess I'll fire some questions at the panelists, and maybe I'll also fire some questions at Professor Bryant Smith here. Liam says, I have so many questions. Great. Excellent. All right.
Can I start by asking a question?
Yeah, absolutely. Please. Thanks.
So I guess it's like not the central theme of your talk, but like this disingenuous or trustworthiness and the role of trust and such. I'm just wondering about the legality of that thing. So like what I'm asking is like, so you're making this, I think, correct argument that if a company presents themselves in an untrustworthy way, that we probably shouldn't trust them with the other things that they say. And I totally agree with that. But what is the action to take to actually prevent this from happening? Or is there a thing that we can do to prevent this from happening?
Yeah, thank you for that, Liam. That's the subject of actually a forthcoming paper focused mostly on tort law, and then another one on administrative law. And there are actually a lot. So first, it's what we can do in existing law. And it's second, the way that judges, regulators, legislators could evolve that law. First, there are in tort claims for misrepresentation, for false marketing, for a lot of the indicators of lack of trustworthiness. However, courts have often restricted those pretty narrowly. So puffery, for example, saying we have the best, our car is the greatest, is legitimate marketing. And I'm not sure it should be. I think we should demand more circumspection in marketing. And courts could have the discretion to evolve those standards, as could state regulators and federal regulators like the FTC. Another example is in regulation, that so much of regulation is transactional, at least in theory, that it looks at, well, what kind of case has the company presented or has the regulator developed based on whether you're trying to prove safety or prove danger. And prior conduct is not relevant. Now, in practice, what we see is regulators at an informal level are using all kinds of intuition about whether companies are good actors or bad actors. And at the risk of giving too much discretion to regulators, those kind of judgments may be worth formalizing to give them more legal effect, so that a company that is open and honest gets more credit than a company that is consistently not. Within each step of legal application, there are these fine-tuning opportunities, sanctions within litigation, claims within tort law, reputation within administrative law, that could nudge us into a more of a framework of trustworthiness. Now, as always, that will kind of work for a few years until everyone figures out how the game is played, and then we'll need a new model. But the fact that we'll always need a new model, I think, isn't an argument against trying. Did that start to answer your question, Liam?
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for asking.
Cool. We have a couple great questions here in the chat that I can read out for you. So the first one is from Abatai. And the question is, the Alliance for Automotive Innovation recently highlighted the need to harmonize traffic laws between states. As vehicle automation increases, will there be a convergence towards a commonly recognized safe behavior, or should these remain highly localized decisions?
Yeah, thank you for that. And Amitai, I always appreciate your careful thinking. And so I'm gonna highlight a word in the question, not at all as a critique, but just as an illustration of the power of language, right? So highlighted the need. Absolutely, that's what the AI did. Now, in that phrase, though, it's the assumption that there is this need and the lobbyists were just calling attention to it. And I would like to push back against that. I think AI argued that we should harmonize traffic laws. It's not clear to me that we need to harmonize traffic laws. Think of all of the diversity in the world, in the physical worlds that automated vehicles are going to have to navigate, right? Weather, different kinds of roads, different kinds of signals, different kinds of human behaviors, different kinds of animals that might jump into the road. There's so much geographic specific variation that coding in some relatively minor differences in the traffic laws of a jurisdiction really is at that point not a particularly difficult burden. When we're talking about the rules of the road that drivers or vehicles must follow. And so this push for standardization, I think, could be justified if the conversation shifts from assuming there's this need and asking what governments are going to do about it to interrogating that and pointing to specific instances where variation in traffic laws significantly complicates the design challenge for automated vehicles or otherwise impedes important public policy goals. And so when we're talking about the second part of your question, safe behavior, there are different ways of approaching that. One is what law says about specific safe behavior in an instance, right? Should you go 50 kilometers an hour or 30 kilometers an hour in a city? The other is what the vehicles do in those instances subject to those constraints. And I expect we'll see a lot of convergence among what the vehicles do, even if those constraints vary city by city or street by street or portion of street by a portion of street. And I'm happy to keep talking about that because I think it's a fascinating set of issues that we can spend some time on.
Cool. So Liam had a follow-up here that and I'll go back to Kevin's question afterwards, but I'd like to also pitch this to the panelists. So you guys feel free to jump in at some point to answer some of these questions. But so Liam's follow-up is, how do we even evaluate if a certain marketing claim is correct or not? And Bryant, if you want to answer that as well, feel free.
Sure. And I'd love to get the panelists in and meet them. What I'll say is part of this is the question of who has the burden. So do we expect regulators or judges or the public or independent scientists to have to evaluate claims and prove that they are incorrect? Or do we expect that companies should have to prove the correctness of their claims? Meaning that if a company says something, they should at least have the initial burden to provide some evidence in support of their claim. And so that question of burden, I think, goes halfway to answering the question. And is really consistent with my general theme, which is we should expect more from companies. We should expect them to put forward a safety case. We should expect them to be forthcoming about not just what's good, but what's hard. We should expect them to publicly discuss instances of lack of safety, because not only is that relevant to consumer behavior, but it's also indicative of a trustworthy actor. And in that same way, putting forth evidence of your marketing claim is evidence of trustworthy behavior. And so what might a company do? Well, if they call something full self-driving, explain every one of those words. If they say that a vehicle is safer, define what they mean. And I think Volvo actually is very careful in this when they say that our goal is that no one will die in a Volvo, in a new Volvo in the next few years. That is metric, death. Who is that being protected? Person in the vehicle, right? By what cars? New Volvos. And they're expanding that out as they get more confident. But that is circumspect and that is careful. And researchers can apply the same lens. I have actually specific recommendations for how agencies should evaluate a trustworthy company, including by asking whether companies are fully engaging with the problem, whether there's an important part of the analysis that's missing, whether there are unstated assumptions, whether the conclusions follow from the assumptions. Administrative agencies are actually really good at this because courts do it to the agencies all the time in evaluating agency behavior. So this is taking an existing set of tools and applying it to a new actor.
Great, and I'll put the same question to the panelists, so just give them a chance to jump in. And we're talking about how do we evaluate if marketing claims are correct or not? So if a certain company says something is full self-driving, how do we say whether or not that's okay to say or not?
So I appreciate what Bryant is saying here, that corporations should be on the hook for this. I think that may be an impossibility though. So I will say that I think the challenge we face is that some of the claims that are made by companies are easy to juke and in a sense are definable by them alone. And so I think academia in this instance presents a great sort of independent judiciary, if you will, that can actually come in and define terms and actually talk about what makes sense or not, and can clarify what is jukeable or not in a way that I think our goal should be to try to make it as accessible as possible so that people are actually aware of what full self-driving car means and why something as simple as like the number of interventions per mile may not necessarily be a stat that is worth thinking about, right? Or may need to be thought about in a very specific frame of reference. So I think the challenge here is, if we allow corporations themselves to decide what is good or not, or what is an appropriate statistic or not, I think it can lend ourselves to lots of interesting marketing problems that, a general public person may not necessarily understand in a way that is useful.
Okay, great. Is there anyone else in the panel that wants to jump in on this question?
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, no, I think that this idea is actually attracting us to try to work around the fact that we haven't a clear way to decide if a self-driving car is really self-driving, or to define what we exactly mean as self-driving, and to say, okay, we will see if the process is transparent, if the data are shared, we can accept, so we can accept, consider legal if you say that the car is self-driving, if it is not strictly speaking self-driving, if the process of starting to introduce this self-driving car is transparent. I think it's kind of an attractive idea because the problem, if you wait for the day that you can really prove in advance that the likelihood of an accident for a given car is below a threshold, I think we need to wait for maybe years, but maybe more. If you have a kind of old-fashioned approach to innovation, to say you basically introduce cars that have a certain degree of self-driving capability, but maybe are not able to be autonomous in every case, you will have crashes, and you will see if this level of accidents is acceptable or not from a societal standpoint. I think that in particular, seeing from Europe, this could be an interesting point of view, because in Europe now there is a kind of, at least in the mind of legislators, there is the idea that you can reduce risk to zero. And this is clearly impossible. So I think this is, and then the issue of the claims, well, I think that the academia should be the third party which decides if a claim is weak, trustable, totally unreasonable. And this is again a matter of discussion, because not everybody in the academia agrees. Also, but this is, what I like in this position is that we have to accept a level of risk, and that, people have domesticated horses without having a minimal idea about how a horse works. We still don't have a very good ideas about how to engineer an artificial horse, right? But the horses have been used for millennia, literally for millennia. So if we follow the example of our ancestors, we probably should start to use supposedly autonomous vehicle, and discover that, for example, your parking system fails in Italy. In certain area, in certain villages of Italy, it will never work. But this you can discover by experience. So I think it's attracting. Of course, you need an healthy academia making the role of a watchdog, being very critical about the claims. But so I think I have to think about it, because I'm sure that we have not strong enough methods to guarantee safety in advance. And just to finish this comment, I was very impressed by Tesla, like Tesla AI days, not particularly from the claim that in 2 years they will have a better humanoids on the planet. On this, I don't know, but I know that the guy has a track record, so I would not be surprised. But what really impressed me was the kind of benchmark infrastructure that they are deploying. So it seemed to me clear that Tesla people is aware of the fact that we need a lot of testing in advance. So probably we need a mix of the two things, but we need, first of all, academia playing its role fully, to fully play its role, to control what is claimed. But I think there is a point in
Those
this.
are some great points, Fabio, thank you. But we just have a couple minutes left, and I do want to make sure that we get Kevin's question in here just before we finish up. And so Kevin's question here is, you said that an ADS should be at least as safe as a human driver in a given maneuver. What if the ADS is safer than a human in aggregate across all maneuvers, but perhaps less safe than a human driver in a given edge case maneuver? And so I guess we'll focus on the legal aspect of that, and we'll just have a couple minutes left before we move on to the next talk.
What if an AV is an airbag, or any other number of safety devices that on the whole are safer, but in individual instances are not? Yeah, so this comes back to the distinction between retrospective and prospective. As tort law operates, the system would likely be defective in the individual case. And the developer of the system will want to be jumping up and down saying, look at all the other lives I've saved. And the attorney for the victim will respond, that's great, but that's not relevant. The question here is whether this system could have prevented this particular injury or death. And if a human could have prevented it and the system would not, there is a very good argument either that the system should have, that is, it was foreseeable, or that it was irresponsible or unreasonable to deploy the system without that kind of supervision. And that might produce liability in the individual instance. But liability in the individual instance under tort law, under products liability law, is not a moral condemnation. It is a determination by society that we think that companies that make products should in some cases pay the costs of injuries that result from those products. That is not a condemnation of the company. That is not a criminal indictment, and is not a prohibition against selling in the future. It is an economic and social determination. So what in that case? A company will presumably address that instance. And as with other products, they will, in hopefully a small number of cases, be civilly liable for those injuries without being morally culpable. Now, in the prospective, there may be a very different determination. This could be where a company would want to argue, we can save so many lives. We recognize that there may be these edge cases, but on the whole, this is so much better. And that's why I come back, the companies should be making those arguments. It's not that they are deciding, but they are putting forward the arguments, the analysis, the framework, and the information that the rest of us, academia, regulators, the public at large, can use to decide. In the same way that we don't want to tell a company how many LiDAR units they should have and exactly where they should put them, I don't think we want to tell a company exactly what it means to be safe and how you go about proving that, because that will be gamed and that will result in basically designing for the test rather than designing for the ultimate goal of safety. Great question.
Thank you, Brian. So with that, that's the end of our first talk, and I'll pass it over to Claire to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Liam. And I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Anne. Dr. Anne Collin is a senior research scientist at Motional, which is, if you don't know, it's an autonomous vehicle company which was formed in 2020, built up from Hyundai and a collaboration between Hyundai and Aptiv. And then Aptiv was built up from companies Nutonomy and Automatica. Anne works at the intersection between complex systems and policy making. She works specifically in ethics of AI and the sociological aspects of their use. She received a master's, an MSc from the École Nationale des Ponts et Chaussées in France, and then an MSc in technology and policy and a PhD in aeroastro from MIT. She is an expert in both the technology and policy of the design of algorithms for autonomous vehicles. And it's a pleasure to have you speaking at this workshop, Anne. So let me just remind the audience to please use the chat function during Anne's talk if you have questions, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question during the discussion. And with that, Anne, please go ahead with your talk.
Thank you so much. When I share my screen, I just wanted to say that I'm very honored to be here. I'm also very thankful that this venue exists in the first place. I think this is one of the very few times we get to speak about all these very interesting topics. So very happy that I get to be here and these discussions are happening in the first place. So today I'm going to talk about evaluating risks of AVs. So a slightly very related topic to what happened in the first discussion panel. Actually, what we just talked about, I feel, is a better introduction as to why this risk evaluation is needed than this way, but I'm just going to go over it just for the sake of it. So we all know that safety is a critical aspect of AVs and of their acceptance in societies, and we have to demonstrate some proficiency for communities to accept AV deployments. This is from a Motional 2020 mobility report, and we've just talked about the necessity to test before deploying in some communities. And when we go back at safety, and this is not about safety, this talk is not about safety specifically, I'm sure we'll hear more about it later. One aspect of it is, the functional safety that is very common in automotive industry, and that is one aspect of gaining trust into the system. However, it's difficult to only rely on this because there are so many parts of AVs that are stochastic, that we don't necessarily understand fully to a level that would be needed to demonstrate safety in this manner. And so we have to go into these risk balance discussions. And so an analogy that one could have during my talk is with a domain that has been doing these risk balance, that has focused more on demonstrating the benefits and looking at the risk benefit balance at the population level, and that we've heard a lot recently is the clinical and pharmaceutical industry. So they get guidance from various agencies in the government. They also have, the FDA had also, specifically for the COVID vaccines, released a bar for efficacy before they would be considered for authorization. And so we can try to think about how we can learn from these domains in our own considerations for risk evaluation for AVs. So the main thread in this presentation is that first we can just talk about what risk and performance really is, because benefits and risks of AVs are really linked, because the whole message that we've been hearing is that AVs are mostly here to save lives, and so yes, the risks and the benefits are about AV performance and their ability to avoid death and injuries. Even though we've just heard that there is more to it than that. However, we're going to see that this is relatively hard to measure in terms of just looking at death and injuries, especially before deploying. And even when we come up with surrogate metrics that we can then measure more easily, how do we know that whatever we're measuring in our lab-like settings are relevant when the AVs are deployed in nature and actually being used as a mobility service. And so the goal of this presentation is to discuss ways we can evaluate risks of AVs before deploying them and efficiently. And in the spirit of what was said earlier, I should say that all of this is active research, and we're bringing this to encourage discussion. I don't want to mislead anyone about actual claims that Motional would be or would not be doing. So looking forward to the talk, and yeah, just wanted to manage expectations for these topics. So first, let's define AV performance. So we've heard these numbers before, but about 40,000, 37,000 death in road traffic accidents in the US every year, based on the UNC report from 2007 to 2017, and more than 2 million injured in road traffic accidents every year. And so when we consider the risks and benefits of AVs, there is also a point that if AVs, or when they become proficient to a point where some of those deaths can be avoided, there is a cost to not having them on the road. And so if they are safer at some point than actual driving in specific ODDs, and we don't know, then that's also a risk. And so the goal is to be able to find as much as we can about the performance before releasing, such that we don't have to wait decades potentially, and we lose on all these lives that could have been saved. However, crash rates are difficult to measure. So just looking at AV crash rates and comparing them to human crash rates per mile, as we've talked about, is really hard because those numbers are relatively low. It's also undesirable to just have an AV be involved in a crash for perception, and also, for the testing for anyone in a company that would work on AVs. And so there are crashes. We've talked earlier about the process measures and companies that can work on their internal processes and claims to have a good safety culture. And there's also the concept of surrogate safety metrics. So the idea is to leverage those to demonstrate AV performance without having to witness or observe AVs being involved in crashes. And there's work that has been published by Dr. Benoon, Dr. Lizarzo, and Dr. Stevens, who are on this call, about using precursor events to estimate outcomes. So this is based on Heinrich's triangle, which was used in workplace accidents. And so the idea is that for one fatality, you have a lot of things that happen beforehand that can be measured, and that can be leading metrics to help you foresee and estimate lower frequency events. And so the idea is that you can witness a lot of unsafe behavior and catch that before you can actually, before it actually gets to the point where there would be a fatality in the workplace. And it has been seen that in terms of, for the AV safety, violating the rules of the road could be one of the leading metrics for future crashes. and that hard braking, acceleration is another thing we can observe that's easier to measure than full crashes, that is also predictive of crash risk, and near crashes. So all of these interactions that don't lead to a crash, but that are unsafe in and of themselves are also predictors of crashes. And so the idea is that we can observe non-crash incidents to predict crashes and have an easier quantity to measure. And this is where rulebooks is brought up. This is the name of our team at Motional, where we try to quantify AV behavior by writing rules, which come with violation metrics that capture both traffic laws and also local driving behavior, ethics, preferences. And the goal is, one way these rules could be used is as leading safety metrics. So examples are, don't collide, maintain clearance, see up to pedestrians, drive comfortably. And the idea would be to use them as surrogate metrics to foresee or as a proxy for how safe the AV is. There's a lot more to rulebooks than just that, but that's one aspect that we can highlight here. And then once we have these metrics that we can measure, how much, this is the question that came up earlier, how much do we know about them in our lab setting versus what they would be in real life? For instance, rules are easily more or less evaluated in a specific scenario, but how do we go from there to being able to evaluate a rule violation in a specific ODD, for instance? And how many, among all the scenarios that we've tried in our simulation, for instance, or before deployments, how do we know that we've tried enough scenarios or that they were diverse enough? And so we've recently published some work about trying to answer this question, which is the assumption that is also in clinical trials is that the sample that is used for the trial resembles the one that will receive the treatment. And the issue with autonomous driving is that there's a very, very large number of scenarios that come in frequencies that are really difficult to estimate, even when you're limiting to a specific ODD. And so the solution that we are researching is to choose scenarios to maximize our information about AV performance. Because again, the idea is that if AVs do become safe to a point where it on balance is better than humans, not having AVs is on the road is a risk. And so trying to come up with as much information as possible, as quickly as possible, is part of the idea. And so this is all summarized in a paper that's called Plain and Sample. Don't want to dig too much into the math because the discussions we're having here are more interesting than that. But the idea is that performance is modeled by a Bayesian hierarchical model, and we define information based on that. And a nice property is that information gain using this model has diminishing returns, which intuitively kind of makes sense because we think that we're going to learn a lot about the AV in the first few scenarios, and as we keep testing and testing, we're going to keep learning, but just at a marginal rate. And so the idea is to decide at some point that the information that we gain is too low, and that it is and that this is where we could stop testing scenarios for this specific part of the risk evaluation. And so the main takeaways for this talk are that yes, there are risks to AVs, but there are other domains that have been dealing with risk before deploying a solution, and that at some point there is a performance that could for AVs that could outweigh the risk. The question is, where is that threshold? And how do we measure the system's capability to meet that threshold? And yeah, how do we make sure that whatever we measure represents what is going to be seen in real deployments? And I just wanted to put this out there. This is also from Amitai. I've mostly talked about the lower right corner of this, which is how do we measure safety, but just wanted to put it out there that we have the sociological aspect about how safe is safe enough, which was already actually discussed a bit earlier, and the political aspects, which are who decides and enforces safety standards, because in my analogy, right, some of these were provided by the FDA. So yeah, this is the end of my talk. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Anne. As folks are thinking about their questions, and you, as I said, you can feel free to put them in the chat or put up your hands or unmute yourself and ask. I thought I'd start with a question related to the rule books scenario that you showed and the group that you run at Motional. So you've designed this concept of rule books, which try to capture good driving behavior through these rules. How do you combine these rules, which are like control rules, with the kinds of the sensors around the vehicles? So in assessing the uncertainty, presumably a large part of that assessment deals with for example, perception. So information coming in from the cameras that goes through some perception processing and then is used to drive the action of the car. How does one assess the uncertainty around perception when it comes to these specific rules in the rule book?
Okay, great question. Yeah, so I think there is a good distinction that I think you're already making in the question, but I just wanted to clarify that I think there are two different ways rules and a rulebook can be used. And I'm dealing with this when I know Andrea is on the call, and he's been one of the fathers of this of the rulebook. So I'll feel free to interrupt at any time. But here in my talk, I think the idea is to use rules in an offline evaluation setting where you would evaluate the system given an all-knowing, you would know everything about the world, which is definitely possible in simulation where you control everything. The other way rules can be used is in the planner part, the motion planning, where you would plan your trajectory given uncertainty around things around you to minimize your rule violations. And so I think, Jane, your question is more about the second part, which is when you have uncertain inputs into your planner, how do you manage your rule violation? I think this is a very topical question, and there's a lot of active research around this, especially in the behavior prediction field, where you would need to know how actors are going to behave to be able to minimize your rule violations, because of a lot of the rules are about your interactions with others, whether it is yielding or maintaining clearance. So yeah, I don't have a good answer for your question, but I can send some research.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right. It's a really topical question, which is why I'm kind of asking, because I wonder, even the like using the terminology of Bryant, the prospective case. So you're trying to do this ahead of time, or trying to work on this analysis ahead of time. Is there, I know there are different ways for assessing uncertainty of sensors, but it seems in that analysis, the rulebook analysis, that even ahead of time, you would have to make some assumptions about how to quantify the uncertainty in these components that interact with the environment, the sensors that take information from the environment. So I guess my question is more about it. I mean, it could be in the retrospective, but also, or in the active case, I guess, but also in the prospective case. Is it that one assigns an uncertainty to the sensors and then uses that in this analysis ahead of time?
Yeah, so the goal is really to assess the vehicle as a full system. So you can imagine the vehicle just being a black box. And so there would be uncertainty coming from the sensors, or it's just this thing. It could even be, you could even apply this to any other system, not just AVs, but you have this black box that you're trying to assess and your uncertainty around it. The way we've captured it is through information gain. So you have a vehicle, you don't know how it behaves, you happen to see bits of its behavior in specific scenarios. You know that's not the full picture, but you also know that you will never be able to observe it in every possible scenario. And so you have some structure for how it behaves, which is the Bayesian hierarchical model. And based on that, you can define uncertainty in an information theoretic way. So you have these probabilities of behaving in specific ways in specific domains, and there's an entropy related to that probability distribution. And then your information gain is how much uncertainty how much your entropy goes down as you observe the AV in more and more scenarios during your tests.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, I appreciate your answer to this question. I think it's a really kind of tough one that a lot of us have been grappling with, and so it's great to hear your perspective. Okay, so let's go to the chat. Actually, Liam asked a question that I was thinking about as well, and let's pose it to our panelists. Liam asked this question, and in particular to Guglielmo, but to the other panelists as well. We're curious for everyone's perspective about this question, that is it the case that if we can evaluate predictive risk, then that's the end of the story? I mean, I think the answer is no, but we'd like to hear everybody's comments on this. So can we really treat autonomous vehicles the same as drug risk or the probability of having a house fire? So can we maybe
Happy
get
to
some
start.
comments? Great, Guglielmo.
Okay. Okay, well, I would say no for at least a couple of big reasons. So I think that there are a couple of directions that are somehow evolving and cannot, prohibit to, let's say, close the story with a single sentence. So first of all, from one side, I think that the risk of autonomous vehicles is strictly is strictly dependent to the relative composition of the circulating fleet of vehicles. So I can assess the risk if I have a few autonomous vehicles driving around, or I can assess the risk if I have many autonomous vehicles driving around. And we expect to be, let's say, very different risk pools and very different risks. And this is very interesting from our perspective, because if we think that the share of autonomous vehicles will increase over time, it could be the case that we reach a local minimum of the riskiness, for instance, and then it could be hard to push for, let's say, increasing the number of vehicles, because we see that we have, let's say, a decrease in global performances because we have a slightly higher number of vehicles around. So for these, I think that as in mathematical optimization, we need to be smart to let's say exit from the local minima and to assess what will happen, let's say, far from our current situation. So this is one evolving and then dynamic direction, and the other one is more let's say epistemological and philosophical one. That is, we can expect that in the midterm future, we will try to assess the riskiness of autonomous vehicles by maintaining the current paradigm. So we will try to put some patches here and there and to match what we expect to see, but without changing the whole framework. What will be necessary in the, let's say, long term and after the midterm, but for sure in the long term, would be to have a sort of revolution and create a new paradigm for it. So this is why we cannot give a final answer now, and we cannot expect to have a final answer in say few years. So we need to be ready for the change, and we need to. I think that we need to cooperate for this. So I think that this is also related to the previous discussion. I think that the single entities can assess the, let's say, single entities can assess some specific claims by industry. But if we want to assess the global effect and the global impact of autonomous vehicles, we need to cooperate, because I am pretty sure that nobody will consider all the implications. I mean, no, not a single one will consider all the single implications, and so we need to discuss and learn from the, let's say, orthogonal aspects and orthogonal stakeholders.
Thank you, Guglielmo. Jane.
Oh, thanks. I think we've got two benchmarks that we're working with, and one is the prospective safe operations of each company's systems, because they'll each operate differently and they'll offer different proofs. But then, as Guglielmo, am I saying it right? I hope.
Oh, sorry, I don't presume to speak Italian.
Sorry, it's like a prank.
So as you were saying, we then have to look as though we're looking at a public health case to assess how these vehicles, the automated vehicles, integrate among human drivers, and over time, how they integrate among themselves and among human drivers. And so that's mind-boggling as a safety exercise. And what I would propose instead is to set up some arbitrary integration benchmarks. Let's say 5% integration, 10% integration, 25% integration, and set the margins on the vehicle's performance and driving behavior in a way that's consistent with good roadmanship, consistent with good traffic throughput, consistent with good traffic calming. And with that optimal driving behavior assigned to the AVs, understand what safety benefits you get, public health benefits you get at each level of integration. And once you've got those data, I think it goes back to the civil sector that Brian spoke to determine whether the public safety, public health benefits are powerful enough. And in that case, perhaps, back to the laws and how we make them, we may decide that we have to write AV driving behavior regulations to assure that they operate within the margins that provide protection for the fleet as a whole.
Thank you.
And if I can add a small remark, we also had to consider another difficulty that is, let's say, falls always into this human machine interaction. The issue is that as soon as an autonomous vehicles will hit the road, they will know in some sense what to do, and they will know in some sense how to interact with humans, because they will have these starting algorithms. what is not sure is how much time it will be necessary for humans to understand how to interact with autonomous vehicles. And we see the very same issue with ADAS now. We know that it takes some time to understand how to use the ADAS in your car. So every one of us knows someone that does not use the ADAS on his on its vehicle because it don't know how to use them, or he's scared by the technology. And so this is a very tricky point because it is hard to assess. We cannot say how much time it will take for a human to interact in a positive way with the new technologies. And so this is another source of uncertainty.
Fabio.
Yes, I would first, I would say that personally, I think that the drug testing and drug validation could be a good approximation, because there are similar differences, but also similarities, because when you take aspirin, all the people taking aspirin are different, and the internal environment of having person taking a drug is substantially different. So there is already, I'm obviously it's not the same thing, because we have the car, the analogy is the fact that you have very different cities in very different situations. So you have a lot of combinatorial possibilities. And actually, I think we still have a limited conceptual understanding of what is relevant and what it is not relevant, because the combination are really a lot. And as told before, the fact that Tesla, for example, aims to use it to approach the problem with brute force, so to really simulate with high fidelity simulation a huge number of random situation, I think is not so bad. This, I think, carries, but this is digression from the main point, also as a political issue, because of course there are companies which have huge capital resources, and companies which have maybe that could be more innovative, which have lower capital resources. So maybe some kind of consortia of all the players, or some direct public engagement to develop the validation procedures, I think should be considered. Because otherwise I should trust the biggest company because they have biggest simulation, question mark, simulators, question mark. So they can put more people tagging data, and so they can do better. I think this is not good for the healthy of the industry. So if the quantity of simulation scenarios matters, and if the level of detail of the simulation matters, I think that at some point we need some kind of public also in the American sense, so not necessarily the federal government creating an agency, but several companies creating an agency which is independent from the company. So you may have different, but otherwise I think that the game becomes distorted because clearly some companies have more money. So, but this is one point. The other point is that I told already is that the analogy with clinical research is it makes sense. And then I have just a slightly provocative statement, but I just pop it out because are we sure that having less humans reduce risks? Because very much likely, if you have a man, a human, maybe a woman in the car, you feel safer. But if the algorithms will fail, the person can take back control. but at this point, you should pay attention all the time, right? Also, the fact that you have humans driving on the streets couldn't actually help safety, given that humans are able to manage unexpected events better than algorithms. But this is a poor provocation, because for a long time I thought that the only way is to have only self-driving cars on the streets, so we are safe. But I also think that in a transition, having many humans could help.
Yeah, thank you for those provocative questions, Fabio. And I wish we had more time to spend. And I'll ask Liam. Liam, do we have time for one more question for Anne, or do we need to go on to the next talk and panel?
Unfortunately, I think we should probably move on, but I would encourage her to engage in the chat and answer those really excellent questions from Bryant and Linda in the chat, if possible.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Anne, for your great talk. Do you have one more word to say at the end, Anne?
Well, I maybe to caveat the analogy, I would say the goal is really to take our heads out of like the specific system we're designing. And, you know, the goal of the clinical trial analogy is to say, look at the system in its environment where it's going to be deployed, rather than just designer specific metrics that we tend to come up with as developers, because we're very focused on our car, if that makes sense.
Thank you for that last point. And thanks everyone for your questions. I'd like to pass the stand over to Jane, who's going to moderate the last session, and Jane will introduce Kevin.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to introduce Kevin Gay, who, while I have his official bio in front of me, I've known him and worked with him for many years, which deepens my appreciation to him for his work and for joining us. He is the Director of Safety Standards Policy at Aurora, Aurora with the mission of delivering the benefits of self-driving technology safely, quickly, and broadly. In his role, he heads up Aurora's approach to industry safety standards, including technical engagement with industry standards development organizations, as well as development of internal policies governing the utilization of technical safety standards. He serves as the secretary of IEEE P2846 Working Group. He's a voting member of the SAE On-Road Automated Driving Committee, and he leads Aurora in the Automated Vehicle Safety Consortium. Prior to Aurora, Kevin had emerging industry safety standards at Uber's Advanced Technologies Group, ATG. Prior to the private sector, Kevin worked for 16 years at the US DOT, our shared alma mater, as senior advisor for technology policy at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, where he led major initiatives on automated vehicles and vehicle-to-everything communication technology. Kevin has a Bachelor of Science in Applied Math from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Kevin, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you to everybody for the chance to talk to you today about Aurora's approach to safety. So let me share my screen here, and hopefully should be good to go. All right, so I'm going to go through and make sure I save time because we've had some great discussion today. So let me get going and talk about kind of how we approach things. Really is, you know, Aurora's mission to deliver the benefits of self-driving tech, you know, safely, quickly, and broadly. And everything we do really focuses on safety as a core to that. So what is our approach to safety? Ultimately, the way we've been thinking about it is through a safety case-based approach. And the idea behind that is the safety case provides this overall structured argument that's supported by evidence, and safety performance indicators, which I'll talk about later, to justify that this system is acceptably safe for a specific application in a very specific environment. So the idea is that this safety case provides a framework. There's not a single piece of evidence that sort of captures captures the totality of safety, much like there's not a single standard out there that captures the totality of safety for automated driving systems. There's a lot of complex interactions and relationships between the various claims and evidence, and that's what this is intended to detangle. So let me talk about how other industries, very briefly, I'll just touch on this. This isn't a new invention. This has been around for about 30 years, initiated in the oil and gas and chemical industry, and then has evolved into transportation space as well through rail and aviation and automated vehicles at this point. So we see it as a helpful tool that certainly has been proven in other safety critical industries. So we think it's a good jumping off point for how we customize it for automated vehicles and for Aurora's system. So our overall guiding philosophy is that there's a set of principles that we try to adhere to in the development of our safety case. Now, there are 5 different ones that I'll talk through here briefly, but they really cover basically all range of operations that you could envision. They also cover things like misuse and unavoidable issues. But the other thing that I wanted to touch on, which I heard Bryant mention earlier, is the issue of trustworthiness of the enterprise. That's also an aspect that's covered in the way that we build our safety cases. Let's see. So let me start at just the highest level, and I'm kind of jumping through these fast so I know that we have time for the discussion. If you go, our safety case is public, and the link is down there, and I can drop it in chat at some point. But the idea is that we've broken our safety case down into 5 different claims. One of proficient, which means it's proficient to execute the dynamic driving task. Fail safe, effectively it can respond to faults and failures in a safe way. Continuously improving, that is sort of targeted toward we're monitoring the development and on-road performance of the system and ensuring that it is continuously evolving, and we reserve the right to continuously improve the system even post-deployment. Resilient really looks at reasonably foreseeable misuse and other sort of like cybersecurity and other types of events. And then the last one is really the trustworthy component of it, which is how is the enterprise trustworthy, and how do you demonstrate that? So for each of these claims, the way our safety case is structured is they break down into subclaims. And so for the proficiency, which is probably the one most folks are like super familiar with, if you think about it, they focus very much on the design, the engineering, and the testing. Can you handle nominal conditions? Can you handle off nominal conditions, corner cases? This also is where we cover our when we use safety drivers. And so this would also be included in there, that our safety drivers, when they're operating our test vehicles, that we have the appropriate controls in place, the appropriate training, the monitoring, all of the pieces that you want in there. So this claim is, this goal is pretty meaty because it does include all of the testing that you would do for the self-driving system as it moves through development into either simulation, track, or road, as well as our vehicle operators as well, and kind of how you measure their performance. The second one is really around the fail-safe components. And so the fail-safe side of things is pretty interesting. We're really looking at like, what is the rate of system failures? And then when there is a failure, how do you mitigate it? And do you mitigate it safely? Certainly, having a lot of failures may be more indicative of product performance if you're safely mitigate all of those. So if every time there's a fault or a failure, you're performing a safe stop, and you're resolving to a minimum risk condition, and you're out of traffic, and et cetera, then you start to look at the presence of those failures, how frequent they are. That sort of starts to tell you a little bit more about performance of the system from a viable business perspective. But what this is really focused on is kind of how you respond to those in a safe manner. The continuously improving piece, this one is one that is definitely super interesting to me, because part of my work is really focusing on safety performance indicators as well. So in this particular claim, we really are looking at how do you monitor the performance of the system in operations, what that looks like, what are the indicators that you use, and how frequently are you tracking to them. And then it also looks at what are your risk management processes to proactively identify anomalies in the system, and then also when they are identified reactively, how do you handle those as well? And so each of these claims, if you go to our website, you can continue to sort of expand down, 4 or 5 levels for each of these, showing how we would build out the evidence to support these claims. The fourth one is tailored very specifically on cybersecurity and misuse, ultimately. And so this is also, and then I guess I should also say this is also where crashworthiness is included as well. But so 4.1 is really the crashworthiness aspect, and 4.2 is potential misuse with customers or other road users interacting with the system. And then 4.3 is focusing very specifically in on how do you manage cyber intrusions from that perspective. So the one I'll stop a little bit on and talk about is the trustworthy aspect. This is something that differentiates Uber's and the previously Uber had our safety case framework. Aurora has this updated safety case framework that we've evolved. And throughout the development, the trustworthy component has been something that sort of stands out, that's a little bit unique to the way that we're building this. And part of the reason is you can go look at like the UL 4600 standard that does a great job of identifying a number of things that developers need to look into. But the trustworthy side of things is something that isn't well covered in there, because this is more on the organizational side. And the things that we look at really in this goal is, what is our organizational environment? Is it appropriate really for safety critical systems? Do we have good safety concern reporting processes? How do we encourage employees to be open and honest with us about safety concerns across the organization? What do we do with them? How do we resolve them? How do we learn from them? This is also where we encourage this claim is focused a lot on, do we regularly communicate and interact with stakeholders in the environment, whether it's our regulators or it's industry standards organizations, or even safety advocates. And then finally, we look a lot at how is the entire enterprise reviewed and even sort of audited by other folks and internally. And so these are all pieces that we really think a lot about that build up to a story around trustworthy and ensuring the claims there are met. So I'll stop for a second and talk a little bit about how we tailor our safety case framework. What I've just sort of breezed through at the high level is here's what the entire sort of expanse of the framework looks like. Not every single claim in the framework is going to be needed for every single safety case that you build out. There are what we call separate tailored safety cases for the different applications that we execute. So if we have a safety driver or a vehicle operator monitoring the system and on-road testing, there's a specific safety case for that. That is tailored to it to include the claims that are necessary to roll up to the top level claim. Now, as you move to potentially having no safety driver or vehicle operator, and you're testing the system in a track environment, you would have a different set of claims. Clearly, most of the claims around, the vehicle operator and driver monitoring and all of that would not be relevant when there is no safety driver monitoring the system. Then, as you move into the road environment, I would say the same thing. You're going to have a more expansive set of claims as you're testing on public roads with no safety driver in there. And so for each one of these, the way that we go about it is building out what are the claims that are in scope for the product and the application. How do we go about building the evidence for this and integrated it into the work that we do on a daily basis at Aurora? And so the idea is a completed safety case really is this overall structured argument that includes all of the elements of industry regulations as well as standards. It really provides a clear and defensible argument that the system is safe to operate. But what we think it's not is we don't think this is really a regulatory framework, and we don't think it's kind of a single standard that addresses or defines self-driving safety. This really is a way that defines how we work in Aurora, because each of the claims are owned by different parts of the organization, and they're embedded into the way that we work on a daily basis to generate the evidence that ultimately is used to define and build the safety case. So I guess the last thing I'll talk about is something that's sort of near and dear to my heart from all of the work in AVSC and in now in SAE's ORAD and a few other places is safety performance indicators. So this is something that I've been spending, a lot of time thinking about in terms of what do the top level safety performance indicators look like. So, at the very highest level, safety, self-driving vehicles are acceptably safe to operate. Ultimately, after deployment, those are probably the indicators that are probably going to be used to measure that is collisions and traffic enforcement violations, things like that. But what we really want to do is measure that in a leading way. You don't want to wait till that point that you deploy and accumulate data to be able to understand that. And so building the leading indicators is what is definitely a challenging approach. And so the way that we're thinking about it is we're looking at what are top level leading indicators, like maintaining your safety envelopes, like hard braking, like these other things that you can measure from a system level as leading indicators. But then we're also building out safety performance indicators throughout the safety case framework for each of the claims to help ensure validity of those specific claims. And so any of the claims that we've started to look at in our safety case framework, some very simple ones is in the fail-safe area. And I can just jump into that one for time, just for the sake of time here. We clearly call out the frequency of unplanned, unexpected minimum risk maneuvers is sufficiently low, and the systems are designed to operate. Identified faults and failures are tracked in the system. We're able to identify the indicators that would help measure each of these claims in addition to the evidence that's provided. Similarly here with the rate of successful fault detection and response activations is exactly high as well. Clearly for each of these, they're going to line up with the ODD that we're looking at deploying in, because the faults and failures and just the conditions in each operational design domain can be a little bit different. So we're going to tailor it a little bit for that and ensure that we're at the performance level that we're comfortable with. Similarly, in our proficient goal, we would look down at our testing processes. And if you go down, we can look at the traceability that our testing requirements provide, sufficient coverage, and that the anomalies are analyzed, and that we've comprehensively evaluated the system on a validated and representative sets of tests. There are SPIs that are associated with each of those claims. And the intent is, if we can look at all those in a leading way as a part of the structured argument, then that starts to give us confidence that our system is acceptably safe to deploy overall. So let me stop there, since we're about 15 minutes in, and maybe open it up for questions or turn it back over to Jane.
Thanks. That was great, Kevin. I got a note from Liam that he has a question for you, so let's start there.
Hi, thanks for the great talk, Kevin. So I've been thinking about, in connection with what Brian's talking about and what Anne's talking about, like there are these parallels that we've tried to draw to past engineering systems that are maybe have like potential safety risks. And, also in the case of like evaluating risk, whether we can like treat these from a risk evaluation perspective the same as other systems that we have in the past. And the thing that strikes me as different, and it's like something that was brought up in Brian's talk, is that in this particular system, it seems like we can't just evaluate it from a safety standpoint just the way we would any normal engineering system. And part of the reason that is that we always have the comparable of the human driver as the benchmark that we have to beat. And that's like a very high benchmark in some sense, right? Like in fact, it's not even a well-defined benchmark, because the counterfactual analysis is impossible to say whether a person could have avoided this accident in the past. That's like an impossible, like some human probably could have, So I guess long-winded question, but what I'm trying to wrap my head around in the connection of all of these three talks is how much your approach to safety is affected or specifically guided or changes or is more difficult because you have always this comparable of the human compared to just some other regular engineering system that you would build, that you could use these like typical tools for evaluating safety. I'm not sure if that was.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I mean, from my perspective, the reason I think it's so difficult is you're replacing the entirety of the human driver's actions in performing the dynamic driving task. It isn't a single focused automotive system like take automatic emergency braking that's very focused on avoiding a critical scenario or a handful of critical scenarios that it can be decomposed to. And you can decompose that into requirements, and you can follow a systems engineering V model specifically for that. That's a whole lot harder to do when you're talking about, in my experience, replacing the entirety of the human driver performing a task, because there's a variety of things that human drivers are very good at doing. Take guarding behavior, for instance, or when there's an occlusion and a human driver realizes, okay, well, there's a bus pulled over on the side of the road. Perhaps, someone's going to run in front of that bus, and we need to be cautious of that. Or another instance of where frequently on the highways around here, another driver may cut in front of me at a high rate of speed, violate my safety envelope, but then they are accelerating away from me. And so I maybe don't brake in that situation because I know that driver is not likely to put on brakes in front of me. There's a lot of sort of edge cases and scenarios that, we see good human drivers are able to kind of handle at a reasonable risk level in the environment. And so trying to decompose that down into, what are the scenarios you should test for? What are the requirements you should build to? What are the safety performance indicators that you're really looking at? I think that's where really the challenge is. The comparing to human behavior, I think there are ways to do that. I think, there are benchmarks that we see that you can build out, but I think it's just sort of the totality of the problem that is where I see the challenges.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks. Maybe one final thought. Can I leave? Like, is comparing to humans really the right way to approach this problem from a safety perspective at all? I guess is maybe a thought that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's definitely something. That's sort of what I was kind of hinting at here too, is that, our safety case is not, we're better than a human driver, we're as good as a human driver. That's not what our safety case is. Our safety case is, our systems are acceptably safe to deploy on the public roads there. And so, we've been talking about, and we've continued to explore in the industry kind of what that really means, what acceptably safe means. Previously working at NHTSA and seeing that we have anywhere from 35 to 40,000 crashes a year in aggregate. That's also why I asked that question of Bryant is, in aggregate, if this technology can, when deployed, is able to reduce crash rates and save 10,000 lives a year in aggregate, should we not be deploying that if perhaps there are edge cases that a human driver could perform better in? And I think that's where you sort of we sort of think of it as, or at least certainly I think of it very broadly in terms of, societal improvement and safety on our highways. And, where we're at now is really an unacceptable number that folks have, everyone agrees it's gotten even worse during COVID here in this country. So.
Liam's got another question here. Liam, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to hijack it too much, but so on the one hand, I think that from a technical standpoint, what you're saying makes sense. You don't really want to compare it directly against human drivers, but if the courts, like one of the things that, that Brian was talking about is like one of the things that a court might look at is like, could a human have prevented this? And also, of course, public perception is always going to compare you against like the obvious comparison of human driver. It's like, it's hard for me to reconcile between the two sides of, on the one case, from a technological standpoint, not wanting to have the direct comparison, but then can you really avoid it? I'm not sure you really can at the end of the day completely,
Yeah, I think completely you can't, but I would say like if you get down into very specific maneuver by maneuver by maneuver, there may be some maneuvers that are just a little bit different and systems handle them a little bit different than humans do. But the way I would think about it is if you're planning on deploying in an ODD, you understand what the ODD looks like, you understand the typical behaviors, the typical scenarios that you would be involved in and expected to be able to handle in that ODD. Completely agree we need to do that in as good or better than the average human driver sort of does in that operational design domain. Does that mean it's going to be better in maybe every single maneuver that's out there and every single behavior? I guess that's where I'm not convinced. Certainly not, you know, now or next year.
What would it do for industry, Kevin, if several other leading companies adopted the same framework and began to approach the safety challenge or align their approach, because they're already doing it, but align it with your framework so that you had, just more companies using this, posting to it, talking to the public from that playbook, guidebook. How do you think that would help establish a common language? Oh, I just gave away my perspective. Do you think it would help to establish a common language among us?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly do. I certainly think that this would really help a lot, because even if you looked at like NHTSA's ANPRM this past, April, when the comments came in, there were like 700 comments and there's a lot of disparity and sort of thoughts around what the frameworks could potentially look like in terms of, safe enough to deploy. And so even if internally, I think it's great developers to have innovation and the ability and freedom to sort of innovate for their particular product, I do think having some ultimate common kind of approach to how we handle safety is valuable for communicating with the public and communicating with the regulator here in the US. I think the standards work that's going on is helping to do that, because there's a number of things coming out of AVSC, coming out of SAE, the UL work. I think that's helping to drive it into that direction. But I do think sort of a safety case based approach gives sort of an overall framework that anyone can sort of plug into and customize to whatever approach they're using internally to ensure that they're safe enough to deploy. Whether it's the approach we heard about, with Motional on the rule books, and we've seen what other developers have deployed and their approaches to determining what's safe enough. I think there's a lot of commonality across that, but maybe we have slightly different ways of talking about it right now.
And are you still with us in the audience?
Yes, yes.
And so when you listen to Kevin's presentation and think about the approach that Motional is taking, what would be left out if you were fitting your own approach into this framework? How would it work?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one. And I always want to be careful because I don't want to misrepresent anything from Motional side. But so you mean what would happen if we looked at risk evaluation within the safety case approach that Kevin presented, or is your question about something?
That's it.
Yeah, I think it's definitely only one part of the story, and using the different approaches and trying to merge them. I think innovation in all of those processes are needed. And so I think weaving in different methods and trying out different approaches for demonstration of proficiency is going to lead to this innovation that's needed, if that makes sense. And going back to the courts, I think if there is an approach that could have been helpful, it's hard to argue that it's not. I don't know how to say this. Yeah, sorry. Let me get back to you on that one. I don't want to butcher my response.
All right. I see a remark from Bryant. Bryant, do you want to unmute?
Oh, hi, Jane.
Hello, Bryant.
Sure. So I really appreciated this presentation, and I particularly appreciated your question, because when it comes to regulation, I think we're asking, do we choose one rule for everybody that is very specific about what they have to do, or do we choose an approach, a framework into which we're encouraging flexibility and innovation in the same way that we want to encourage companies to come up with the optimal arrangement of sensors on their vehicle. I think we want to encourage companies to come up with and even compete on the optimal arguments for this prospective safety, or what Kevin analogously called the leading indicators of safety.
Before we close out this portion, Kevin, you get closing remarks, please.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Bryant just said, and that the idea is, I think this is a challenging problem. I appreciate all the work that everybody in the industry who certainly participates in the various standards activities I'm involved in, as well as these public speaking events. I think there is a lot to do still, and there's still a lot of innovation needed. And so we're certainly encouraging, and it is very encouraging. I constantly read about new developments and about new approaches to these things. And that's really sort of what our safety case framework ultimately is about, is to ensure that there is sufficient flexibility in developing the tools and processes and indicators needed to deploy this technology safely on the roads, because we do think it has valuable potential. And from my time, obviously at DOT, we've thought that as well, that there's a lot this technology could really impact, but it is very, very important to ensure that we deploy it safely and responsibly. And I think we're all doing that, and we're working toward that goal. So really appreciate being a part of this, and certainly happy to discuss offline or have any other questions folks have on the panel.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Liam, back to you.
All right. Well, that closes the IROS 2021 workshop on evaluating the broader impacts of self-driving cars. I mean, I can speak for myself. Personally, I found this an extremely engaging conversation. It's not the kind of conversation that you normally get at technical conferences, and I think it's an extremely important conversation for us to be having. I want to especially thank our speakers, Bryant, Anne, and Kevin, for really, I think, leading this thought train that we went down, and then also the panelists who joined, Fabio, John, Ram, Guglielmo, and Marcelo, for also providing, I think, really interesting insights of how these things might play out from a technological standpoint. So with that, I'll close the workshop. But thank you all for your attendance and participation. And please feel free to reach out to me or any of the other organizers, myself, Angela, Claire, Andrea, or Matt, if you have any further comments. It's a thread that we would like to continue doing at future conferences. So with that, I'll leave you, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.